Well, this has been terrific. These presentations, as several people have said, have been inspirational, and I'm just loving it. Plus, what I'm going to do a little bit in this talk is give you a few ideas of how to use some of these presentations when you go back. So, and that part of that is getting started. So, what do you actually need to get started? And I think one of the things you need is to know the answer to this question. What's the difference between an artist and an architect? And those of you who recall back to your feckless youth when you probably read Atlas Shrugged, you would know the answer to this question. The answer to the question is an architect needs a client or a sponsor. And that's pretty much what we need when we're not artists, despite the fact we call it Semantic Arts. We're not really artists. We have to have sponsors. You have to have a sponsor. And the reason you have to have a sponsor is really just to get permission to consume resources, whether that's buying triple stores or getting, FTEs to come work on your project, or even just yourself to work on the project. Unless you're the sponsor yourself, which lucky you, you don't have too many people to convince, you're still going to have to get some stakeholders on board. So if you get a sponsor, I think you need one other thing that goes along with that. And that one thing I'm calling a hook. You need some kind of a hook to get into somebody's head. And the reason I'm going to riff a little bit on what Heather was talking about yesterday about mental models, because this hook idea goes right into the mental model of your sponsor, your stakeholders. It's what goes into their mental model and allows good things to happen. So here's kind of just a high level idea of the idea of a mental model is that there is a world out there that's complex, and we have a simplified version of it in our head. And most of the time, that simplified version allows us to do things in the world without too much trouble. But every once in a while, somebody gets what has been called an impoverished mental model. There's something in their mental model of the world that doesn't line up and causes them day-to-day problems. This is more in mental health and things like that, but I think it also applies in business as well. People have certain things in their head that prevent them from moving forward. And back in the 70s, there was an interesting movement. I studied a lot. I was not a practitioner because you needed to be a therapist, but the movement was also called NLP. It was not natural language processing. It was neuro-linguistic programming. And what they had figured out was that the linguistic part was when you speak, you reveal clues to what's in your mental model. And they had all kinds of clues, even things as simple as unusual use of pronouns. When people say they're out to get me, that represents there's something in your mental model that at one point somebody did something to you and you generalized it to they, meaning everybody, and pretty soon you can't function in the world. And what these neurolinguistic programmers, therapists would do was use that language to get a clue about your mental model and then gently challenge some part of your mental model, and in many cases had remarkable success with that. So it's kind of an interesting model to think about, because what happens, and almost everybody here has said this, that in business, many of the sponsors and stakeholders have these impoverished mental models about what is possible or not possible, and just giving them the facts in the same way that telling somebody who's having mental problems more facts, it doesn't change anything. You have to reach in and question and politely nudge or cause them to see something they haven't seen before. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how a hook can potentially be that thing that nudges a mental model. So, the good hook challenges the status quo, if you will, the stasis, the thing that keeps in place. We saw some good hooks yesterday. I think you could take almost any one of these presentations, and depending on your situation, just recast it and say, here's what these other people did, because this will challenge the pre-existing mental model of your sponsors. And depending on, you sort of have to guess also from their language, your sponsor's language, what is it that they think that is impeding progress. All of these have the great hook that somebody's already doing this. The one of the impoverished mental models is that this is theoretical, or it's not possible, or nobody could do this. Well, all you have to say is, gee, Nokia has 750 billion triples in their triple store, and all of a sudden, some of that mental model starts to crumble away. So that's the first thought. Now, I just want to give you two more hooks, if you will, and these aren't necessarily things for you to implement, but these are things that I think once you describe them to somebody, and once it goes into their mental model, and especially then you'll see them here in a second, when they go back to their regular work and they stare at what they're dealing with now, and they have this other hook in their head, pretty soon they're going to get more and more dissatisfied with life the way it is. So the value here is in dislodging their mental model. Not, you can implement these things if you want. I think they're pretty interesting, but the main thing is just challenge conventional thinking. So here's what they are. One of them is called zero copy integration. That's a hook. And the other is called the books have already and always been closed. And these are both phrases you've probably never heard. So that makes them a good candidate, I think. This idea of zero copy integration, the reason you probably statistically, it's unlikely you've heard this, is because it's from Canada and it doesn't deal with hockey or curling. So therefore you wouldn't have heard of it. But in Canada, and I didn't make this up, but I like to borrow it because I think it's a great thing to mess with people's heads. They have this thing called the Data Collaboration Alliance, which is working on data standards, some GDPR-like things for Canada, but they also have this pillar that I don't think anybody else has, where they're promoting this idea of zero copy integration. If you peel this back just a little bit, you'll find some of the people behind the Data Coalition Alliance are the founders of Cinchi, which is an interesting graph database low-code system. They put a lot of thought into this. Let's talk about why is this a hook and why it might get under the skin of some of your sponsors or stakeholders. It's kind of evocative, and it's evocative because every system integrator and every data scientist relies on copying continually. They it's like no breathing or something, or I don't know. It's and at the same time, while it challenges their status quo, it leans right into the whole data centric approach. So it's pretty good in that regard. So if you talk to data scientists, they've always got some chart like this, which is the modern data stack, and every time you turn around, it's something else. But the next time you stare at this, every time you put another logo in this thing or in your data environment, it implies that you're copying something from one tool or platform or whatever it is to another, and every one of those copies involves transformation and conversion and changing and all that kind of stuff, to where the bigger and deeper these stacks are, the more and more copies of stuff you're making. I'm going to suggest that that's not necessarily very productive. So here's how traditional systems integration works. People extract something and they hand it off to another process, and then they augment it or they dedupe it or they, do something else to it and reformat it and change the labels and finally, ta-da, there you go. We've done systems integration. And there's pipelines, there's thousands of these things. They're all over the place. And just go into one series of these things, you get to another system, and then you go from there to yet another and yet another. So why is that bad? If that's what people do all the time, what's wrong with that? I mean, the first thing that's wrong with it is just it takes effort. Every copy, there's a human somewhere in the loop there saying, how do you map this from that to that? There is effort. There's also dependencies. Once you get the data pipeline set up, if anything in there changes, it has a ripple effect. You have to go change some other part, and on you go. And the dependency creates brittleness, which creates cost, which, et cetera, et cetera. Copying is generally lossy. A lot of times when you move something from place A to place B, something gets dropped along the way. Some of it you do intentionally. You say, in this part of the pipeline, I need it to be anonymized. Okay, so you lost information, you lost identity. Good in this case. Sometimes you aggregate information, so aggregation loses information. But a lot of the loss is just focus. I don't need all that stuff, so I only take the 3 fields I need. Or lots of it is just accident. Every time it's just like photocopying, or some random things appear and stuff drops out and translation doesn't work, etc. So every copy is at least has the potential to be lossy. I was going to look for a good picture of a traditional data pipeline, and I wandered across the Tokyo Metro, and I thought, wow, that's just about as good as anything I've ever seen. That looks so much like most data pipelines. You can start over there on the right and a little blue thing, and look at all the steps it went through, and then you get to where the blue thing intercepts with the red thing, and you're not quite sure where did it come from. And that's exactly what data pipelines look like. And in an environment like that, it's very easy to lose the trail. It's very easy to not be able to know, where did this data come from. Another side effect of copying is reconciliation. If you don't copy something, you don't need to reconcile it. But as soon as you've got copies of things, it creates a need to reconcile, and need to reconcile is more effort and errors and all kinds of stuff. In fact, that reconciliation is a lot of times what starts projects. People go into a client and they say, well, tell me how many customers we have. And one system says we have 40,000. The other one says we have 42,000. Why is it different? They have to reconcile even an aggregate number as well as all the detail behind it. So I wanted to make it real, as with all the other presentations we had today, I want to do a couple of case studies of this zero. These are case studies of zero copy integration, just to make it a little bit more real. This first one is with an investment bank. This is one of our clients. When we first went in, we went into the legal department, and the legal department has a sub-department called information management, where it's the legal department's opinion of information. So it's not the IT's version. It's what does legal think about things like retention and e-discovery and things like that. Well, in order to have an opinion about retention, the legal department has to know about all the data in the firm, all the databases, but also all the documents and the SharePoint folders and the shared folders and everything, all that stuff, of which, there's, as you can imagine, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these in a large investment bank. So in order to get a handle on that, we not only vacuumed up and triplified all of the databases and SharePoints and folders and all that kind of stuff, but also the organizational structure and all the employees and all their titles and stuff, because one of the hypotheses from the legal department was, if we just knew a little bit of context about who's putting stuff into these folders, we probably have a pretty good idea what's in there. If the fund manager for this particular fund is putting documents in a folder that sounds like that, it's probably that fund. Anyway, we did that. They had a lot of success with that. We had, triplified a large amount of information, and it improved their ability to properly classify documents and folders by like 100-fold. It was pretty impressive, and that effort just they keep improving and improving it. It's a living thing now. Much later, several years later, we got involved in another part of the firm. This is just to give you an idea, even amongst graph people, how entrenched this idea of copying is. And this was a group that was under some compliance pressure to be able to prove especially where PII kind of data was, and was it crossing, country boundaries and all that, was it being handed off to third parties, all that, the kind of stuff that you have to do. So of course they had to hoover up a whole bunch of metadata and data about processes and stuff, but also they needed employee data. And they knew that on this previous project, and they've been keeping it up to date for the years in between, they knew we had this data already triplified. They didn't want to go back to the source system and do it again. That's good. But they said, just give us a copy and we will convert it to our purpose. And we went, wait a minute, you're not getting the point here. See, here's what they wanted to do. They had their little system. They said, give us a copy and we will transform it. Everybody is so used to this idea. Give me a copy, I'll transform it to my local use. And we said, no, think about this. Those are just a bunch of facts about employees. That this one has a name, he or she's in this department, here's the email address, all that. There's no transformation even really possible or necessary. So we did prevail there. They said, oh yeah, I guess we can just use those exactly as they are. And we said, yeah, if you want to ignore some of the triples, ignore them. If you want to add some, but don't copy them and don't transform them. I mean, if you need to copy them for performance reasons, that's a different thing, but you don't need to just go back to that, your mental model of, in order to get data, I have to make a copy and transform it. So why do people want to make copies of data? I think a lot of it is habit. I think it is a mental model kind of thing. People just do that. They also want to feel like they have control over their copy. They have tools that maybe say, I have to have a copy, I have to put it in JSON or something in order to do this. And sometimes they legitimately have to restructure it. If you want to use D3 or something, you have to rename things and rejigger them around. But if you go all the way to triples and graphs, you realize there's really the only structure that exists is there's a bag of triples. And that bag of triples sort of suggests there's no need to restructure it. It just is what it is. It's not a JSON thing. It's not a table. It's not any of that stuff. It really is just a bag of triples. You can ignore them, you can add to them, but at that atomic level, there's really no restructuring to be done. Now, is this evocative, or is it, is there really zero copy? Well, maybe it's the last copy. Certainly the data we're talking about is in some database, or it exists somewhere. We're going to go through some process, turn it in triples and put it in a triple store. Okay, so that's a copy. That is, I'll admit it, that is a copy. Maybe that's the last copy you have to make. What we typically find in most of our clients is we show up and we ask around, and somebody gives us a CSV file that we can turn into triples, which we do. Just like Peter said, we use Tarkle a lot, and that gets us triples. But then after a while, the client says, we're going to move this into production. So what we want to do is take it more directly, maybe from the data lake. But then after a while, they realize, these data lakes come and go. That's not very permanent. Let's kind of move upstream a little bit. Now, luckily, if you did the first thing right, the triples that you're creating, if you have some good minting patterns, things like that, are going to be exactly the same triples you would have gotten from the CSV, except maybe the CSV was lossy. So as you go further upstream, you know, you have the potential to get better, purer, and certainly less latent data. But you finally get back to the source. And when you get back to the source, now all of a sudden you say, wait a minute, I have the data from the source, all of it, triplified. It's in the triple store. And if I just do, what several people, what Peter said, what George said, what a lot of people have said, I can just build an app right on the triple store. And once I do that, I no longer have to rely on the data pipeline or even the legacy system. The whole idea, while up to that moment, this looked like a data warehouse. The triple store looked like a data warehouse. It's a little bit of a Trojan horse, I think, but that allows to get past people's immune systems. Okay, I've got all your data in this triple store. Oh, by the way, let me just show you a few little use cases here. We can do this thing, and then you say, well, let's just start peeling off the legacy system a little bit at a time, and then you finally are getting to a real zero copy. Once you're natively creating the triples and consuming them, now you really don't have to do any copying. Let's do another case study. This is not one of our clients, although I've been following them for a long time. I think what they've done is terrific, and it meets all the criteria of data centric and everything else, and it has a nice zero copy story here. Montefiore is a large healthcare system in the Bronx in New York. Early on, they took, essentially all medical knowledge, if you will, all the relatively publicly and licensable, the mesh and the loincs and the SNOMEDs and the ICD-9s and the CPTs and all that, OMOPs, and put it all into a fairly decent sized triple store, and more importantly, organized it well. And they were able to fund a lot of their system build just from grants and projects they could do just by having this data source. But then they went a step further and did exactly what we were saying a minute ago, triplified all their clinical knowledge. So they have 2 or 3 million patients. They have electronic medical record, epics, they have labs, they have radiology, they have all all that stuff. Hundreds of billions of triples now in a unified triple store. And they can do all kinds of pretty amazing things. But the one I wanted to shine a light on is up to this time, they had this thing that New York, since they're in New York, the New York Department of Health requires that they report on sepsis. So sepsis is where if you get an infection, internally, usually caused by going to the hospital, there's all kinds of, it's very deadly, and there's all kinds of reporting. Did you do all the right things, etc. Historically, you take data from, your EMR and your lab system, your pathology systems, your imaging systems, and all this stuff. And a team of about a dozen people prepare these, sepsis incident reports and send them off to the Department of Health, who then pore over them and find discrepancies and make you do it over again. And it just goes back, well, you said this, but the lab said this, and all that. Well, because they've harmonized all this and done a really effective job of it in their triple store, they now generate their sepsis reports directly from the triple store. The first time they sent it to the Department of Health went, wait a minute, this has never happened. There's no exceptions. There's no, what to follow the story from earlier, there's no reconciliation needed because there isn't multiple copies, multiple sources, multiple stories to have to be put back together. And so one of the outcomes of that for them was that there's 12 full-time people that did nothing but sepsis reporting who now got redeployed to other parts of the hospital. So that's another little success story there. So that was one hook, the one hook called zero copy integration. And it's mostly to go into the brains of systems integrators and data scientists and folks like that, because it will hopefully will mess with their heads. This one's for the accountants in the audience. We call it "The Books Are Already Always Closed," because they know that the books are not closed till I say they're closed, and they're not closed till 15 days after the end of the month, and all that kind of stuff. Let's take a look at what is happening to accounting based on our shining a semantic lens on the problem. Accounting is pretty much unchanged since Luca Pacioli, who worked for the Medicis back in 1494 and was roommates with Leonardo da Vinci, invented double entry bookkeeping. Ebenezer Scrooge, that's what he was doing the whole time with this quill pen and all that. Yes, we've automated it, but no, we haven't really changed it in any appreciable way. And we got started looking at mid-market systems and what had to change and what happens when you put a semantic and a data-centric lens on this particular problem. And I'm now working with a professor at Cheryl Dunn from Grand Valley University. We're taking what we're learning, writing a book, but also building a system, because we want to prove that this really works. But what is still happening, even right now in the 21st century, it's manual. It's after the fact. I run a business, so I have a CEO coach, and he'll come around like in the middle of February and he'll ask me, so how did January turn out? And, in the middle of February, in a typical company, you're just starting to find out how January was. And of course, what you really want to know is how is February or even March. And depending on what kind of business you're in, most of the events that are actually going to affect your financials have already occurred. They're just not in the books yet. We're going to see how that is here in a second. Another thing that is a clue as to what went wrong, the aftermath of the financial crisis, there was some legislation called Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX for short, that said you have to be able to prove where every number on your financial statements came from, and the potential penalties were gigantic and included jail time for the CEO and the CFO. Now, given that Tokyo subway data pipeline for how, most large enterprises, the data that's on their financial statement came from hundreds or maybe even thousands of applications, a torturous path through many Excel spreadsheets, all kinds of stuff like that. So people launched multi-million, often multi-tens of $1,000,000 projects to try and figure out where those numbers came from. Because, the CFO and the CEO didn't want to go to jail. And they would draw pictures that looked a lot like this, usually much, much larger. They would fill war rooms. And by the time they were done, they'd say, yep, we're pretty sure that's where this, and you go, oh, come on, give me a break. You actually don't know. There's so many paths and so many steps along the way. You just don't know. And yet it's knowable. We're gonna look at this and think about this for a minute, but it's totally knowable. So here, this cycle I'm going to describe exists now, but it exists in extremely slow motion, and a lot of manual effort. But none of that slow motion and none of that manual effort is necessary. So events occur. I'm going to do rapidly and then a second pass through it. Events occur in the business that will eventually give rise to accounting transactions, and therefore will eventually show up in the financial statements and books and records of the firm. There is every firm has some set of policy as to how to deal with it. They turn those events, the policy helps them turn those events into financial transactions, that then end up on the financial report. That loop takes days to weeks in a traditional system. It should take seconds, and we're going to take a look at it here. First thing is, most of these events originate outside the accounting department. People buy stuff, or they execute things on the factory floor, or they ship something. They're doing stuff out there that eventually hits the books and records of the firm. We say these are financial business events. It's a subset of all possible business events. Having a meeting, and there's a lot of things you do in a business that does not directly hit the books and records of the firm, but some things do. And what we've discovered is almost all of them are part of a longer term transaction. We call it the long duration business transaction. But for instance, any shipment was preceded by some sales order, contract, something. These things don't just randomly happen. And it's information about that long duration business transaction captured in triples that that can tell you how to treat this event financially and how to classify it. So when the event occurs, if you're in a data centric world, instead of we had a client once, a workers' compensation insurance firm, who discovered and it was only a medium sized firm. This is a company with like 3,000 employees. They discovered they had 23 different systems that each originated the equivalent of invoices. Although most of them didn't even call them invoices, claims overpayment or elevator permitting or credentialing, all these reasons that people had to give them money. But there's 23 different ones of them. They all called them different things. They had revenue recognition problems out the wazoo, etc. What we're talking about here is saying anytime an event like that occurs, it's captured and it's immutable. It's just a set of triples. This event occurred. The long duration business transaction also, the context of that previously occurred. Somehow somebody in your firm committed you to something that led to this event occurring. And then there's accounting policy. And I, earlier in my career, built a lot of accounting systems and dealt with all this stuff in foreign currency and inventory valuation, all this stuff. It's pretty complicated, and I originally thought to crack this nut, we're going to have to build a rule system and then later a domain specific language. Then I eventually got it down to a table, and it turns out it's even simpler than that. I'm describing it in the book right now, but it turns out it's really simple for any given scope. Like, is this part of your primary business for your manufacturing? Or you make to stock? That's one scope, and if it's part of your overhead, that's a different scope. There's just a handful of scopes, a small number of events that will tell you exactly what the generally accepted accounting policy is and how you should treat that. So turns out these are rules, and the rules are also in triples now. So there you go, more triples. But what the rules are about, or the policy, is how should I turn that into financial? How should I monetize it? And how should I associate it with accounts? Does somebody now owe me money because that event occurred? And how am I going to classify it and post it to the, where exactly is it going to show up on the financial statement? So that's what that capture is all about. But of course, that is triples as well. And then finally, we go to the financial statements themselves, which are typically aggregations. But if you're going to publish something, you can aggregate it. And with provenance, with semantics, we have provenance. We could say, I know what I aggregated this from those 1,000 financial transactions. If anybody wants to click on them, here's where that came. This is all triples with provenance. I can get you back to the transaction. The transaction will get you back to the event plus the accounting policy plus the docket if you need it. I mean, the whole, and there's no reason why it couldn't be on the books within seconds after the event occurring, because there's nothing in the process I just described that inherently has to have delay. There's a lot of things that have delay now because, we want to wait till the end of the month and add up these numbers and divide them by some other. No, it's all just math. You can do it as you go. So, and what that means is at any moment in time, you could produce, and one of the things is we're also capturing what's called commitments, purchase order, sales order, things like that. You don't have to report them in all the financial statements. Many people don't. Some industries do, some don't. But if you want to know what's happening in your business, you really do want to know what your various employees have committed you to, what purchase orders they've placed. And the fact that they're not in the accounting system, but they're over there in several procurement systems that you have to move around and figure out, is a problem. But anyhow, the net of all that is at any moment in time, either an event has occurred or it hasn't occurred. And if it's occurred, it's in the books. And, if we've committed, that's in the books. Everything that has happened is known. And if something happens later, it'll be known when it's known. So the books literally are always closed. At some point, you can say, I'm going to publish them, and therefore I'm not going to accept predated transactions from now on. And I think, use a little bit of imagination here. Once you start getting this loop going, you start realizing, well, there's not much need for predated transactions. It shows up when it shows up, and that's when it's going in. So there you go. That went quicker than I thought. Here's the summary for this. Unless you are the sponsor, if you want to get started, you're going to need to find a sponsor. And even if you are the sponsor, you have other stakeholders. So a lot of this still applies. Unfortunately, most sponsors have an impoverished mental model. At least one part of that is, let's stick with the status quo because the status quo works. So we have to challenge that mental model and help them see what's possible. And frankly, almost everything we saw for the last 2 days is helpful in that regard. There's pieces of evidence, or and in fact, here's another takeaway I think you should take back. Several of the people that have been very successful, like take Nokia, have been at it for 4 years. Standard & Poor's has been at this for 20 years. Let your sponsor know that your competitors probably have a stealth program and they've been at it for years. And by the time you find out, you'll be 5 years behind. If that doesn't get them, I don't know what will. But 2 more that you can add to the list just to challenge the status quo. One is what I call zero copy integration, to say, it isn't inherently necessary to keep doing all this ETLing and all that stuff we do. And the other is let's rethink accounting. What if every time I don't think anybody could look at what I just presented and say there's a literal reason why you can't do that. It's not done yet, but why within seconds of a business event happening anywhere in your firm that it isn't immediately on the books. I think that is it. Oh yeah, one other thing, if you weren't already aware that there's our data-centric manifesto is out there. For some thousands of people have signed that. It's pretty inspirational what they signed it with. We have a forum, in-person forum. Can you mute that typing? This is an off-the-wall thing, but I think it might be kind of interesting. Somebody's putting together what they call the data-centric executive course. We're not sponsored to this or anything, but they interviewed me, so they're out there. They're convinced, I think they're right, that executives need to get on board with this idea, and so you might want to push some of your executives, your sponsors, your stakeholders to this. I assume it's going to be relatively easy to digest, but useful. And then if you need to get a hold of me, there I am. So with that, I'm up for questions.
Yep, we had one in the Q&A. Your first zero copy integration case study involved HR data. Did they have to deal with requirement of limiting select users to subsets of the data within the triple store?
Not subsets of users. We had all the employees and all the what they call contingent workers, which is subcontractors who charge by the hour. So they had everybody, but we had a limited number of attributes, because we didn't have a need to know anything more than things we needed to know, things that would help us classify things for retention, which had to do with your job title and maybe some seniority and just a handful of things like that. So we did pick up email and who you report to and what department are you in, things like that. But we didn't get their salary, things like that. So, and sometimes you want to make sure you don't do that because that gets everybody excited, and they, it puts an extra 2 or 3 months on the project. But sooner or later somebody will, and you have to have security for that. Did that answer the question?
Yep, I think so. This one was more of a comment. Reminds me of a Siemens corporate accountant telling me we're happy when we know once a year most of what Siemens owns.
Yep.
Next question. How many
That's a
systems
very
ended?
low stand. Wait, there's a mental model. That's such a low standard for happy. How did you live your life? If your home life, if you said, "Gee, I'd be happy once a year if I knew what I owned," you wouldn't be very happy, right? that's kind of hilarious when you think about it.
Matt Johnson, Dave, how many systems end up being involved in generating events?
Well, in the end game, one. But how many events are there? So I'll tell you what. There's about most industries. You'll have about 15 to 20 discrete financial business events that lead to changes in the books and records of the firm. And then you have categorical differences amongst those, but 95% of them occur in three long duration business transactions. One is to procure something, so you've got the whole procure to pay, which currently is in dozens of systems because you bid and you somehow get vendors approved and you move them through and you place purchase orders, and then you have to go off to the inventory system, or maybe it's services or whatever, to actually receive the product, and then off it goes to accounts payable because a bill will show up and you have to know that there was a purchase order, and then that goes to another system, and on you go. Well, turns out there's 5 events in the procure to pay that actually change the financial results of the firm. There's the commitment in the procurement itself, and then the stream that has to do with the financial side. You'll eventually receive a bill from a vendor, and you'll eventually pay it. And on the other side, you have a right to receive something, whether it's a service or a product. So you will get notification that you've received it, and you will eventually acknowledge and QA and do all that kind of stuff to say, yeah, I accept this. So that's one set of events. It's all going to be in one system. It's currently probably in dozens of systems. The other side is order to cash, but it's just a mirror image. There's a sales commitment, which sets up, you have an obligation to deliver, whether it's a service or a product, and then you have a right to receive payment, which initially will be an invoice from you, and then a remittance from them, and then the other side, depending on what kind of business you're in, you may have to run a project to deliver it. You may build a product. The product might be made to order. It might be made from stock. You might be taking it off the shelf, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, the really complicated one is consuming resources and making things, whether you're in manufacturing or projects or whatever. So there's typically, another 5 or 6 major financial events in that stream. But you can just imagine what I just told you. In a traditional environment, there could be hundreds of systems involved in all that stuff. But really, I think in the end game, I'm shooting for one.
Another comment. Steve asked if this sounds familiar within an organization, and somebody chimed in, I don't know, it's not my part of the business, but it's, quote, all in SAP. So I would guess that part is, quote, well handled.
Well, in most companies, all in SAP means maybe 20%. And of course, in very large companies, there's more than one SAP. At one point, we're here in Fort Collins, and HP used to have a big presence here. And at one point, when they had acquired all kinds of companies, one of their enterprise architects discovered that they had 88 ERP systems, because they had acquired DEC and Compaq and all these places. They had 88 ERP systems, 5 of which spoke to each other. So any given ERP system had 2 or 3% of the total of ERP transactions, which is still only a small percentage of the total number of transactions.
Wow. One more question that came in. If you had the COO as your sponsor and the mandate to do whatever you think is necessary, but at the same time, hundreds of application-centric projects screaming fire and requiring attention to fix their problem ASAP, where do you start?
I try and ignore all those fires. We had a conversation at our retreat a year ago, and we said, we could actually help people put out fires. We're pretty smart, and we know systems and stuff, but it doesn't help. The fires just keep coming. So, and in fact, even with some of our clients now, we're doing the data centric thing, and they're still launching new projects in parallel, and we sort of know that they're doomed. We would love to stop them. We think it's a waste of time, but really, you just gotta let them go. Just let them go. And we say, think big, start small. Do enough design work that you're future proofing whatever the initial thing you're doing is, because you want each project you do to fit into a bigger whole. But then you just got to concentrate on something that you can do with a graph in a relatively short period of time. Pretty much like what Peter said there, those style projects that when the light bulb really goes on, when sponsors and stakeholders see their own data connected up in a way. In fact, Peter's also saying this: the fraud people, when they saw that they could start anywhere and trace, as soon as they see that, they go, "Oh, is that what you were talking about?" Up to that moment, you can go all these presentations you want, and 80% of your audience will have no idea what you're talking about. So it's how fast can you get to their real data in a graph, solving some problem that they previously were struggling with.
And Dave, any comment? It's from Jonathan Storm. Any comment on my recommendation in my presentation about having a concrete problem to solve with data centric?
Yeah, totally agree. We usually wrap that in what we call a competency question, but that's just a way of expressing the concrete problem. And what makes for a good competency question is a question that's currently difficult to answer, but not impossible. You don't want to say, "Oh, my competency question is tell me what stocks are going to go up tomorrow." Well, no, you don't. There's nothing in all the data you have that suggests you're going to know that. But very often there's a question that's hard to answer that shouldn't be hard to answer, like what are all my assets? We worked with an insurance company, and after a while, just kind of you have to talk to people and figure out. At first, you won't guess what's going to be hard because it's hard because of the configuration of systems they happen to have. But in this particular firm, one of the questions was, tell us how many agents a given customer deals with. And you think, well, surely you know that. You have all this contracts and sales orders and commissions and all that. Well, they know it, but it's spread over so many systems they can't put it back together again. You say, oh, that makes for a good, if that's important to know that, it has to be important. And currently, if you ask that question, somebody goes out and does a bunch of extracts and puts stuff in spreadsheets and comes back a couple of days later and says, there's your answer. So you can find those kinds of problems. And if you sort of intuitively think, if I just harvested data from 2 or 3 sources, I could answer that. And when people see the answer, they go, oh, yeah. So, yes, I think having a concrete problem is exactly that.
Awesome. I think that is everything out of the chat. Steve or Dave, whoever's closing us up.
Steve, you want to close it up?
I'm going to conclude with 2 things. First of all, Dave alluded to the DCA forum that we're going to have in person at Fort Collins in June. And the specific dates for that are going to be June 5th, 6th, and 7th of this year. and we will be getting within the next couple weeks those notifications up on the DCA forum website. So if people wanted to just circle those dates and say, well, I'm going to make some arrangements. I've already spoken with a few people that have attended the symposium that intend to come to the forum as well. So we welcome you. And again, that's going to be more centric to the how rather than the why. So we'll be getting into deeper, semantic and knowledge graph understanding and some of the idiosyncrasies associated with that. So that's the one thing that I wanted to give attention to. And gosh, I can't even remember. There was two that I wanted to bring up, but I can't remember the second one.
Yeah, I don't either. I think that's the main one. And to reiterate, it's not hybrid. It's 100% in person. For practitioners, we've been doing this for many years. People, if you're actually solving the problem, I think you'll enjoy this, because we get some vendors and enterprise architects and various people together, and we're just kind of collectively, it came out of this realization that the architecture to solve this problem doesn't exist as a platform or as a package. And so everyone, right, for at least the foreseeable future, you're going to have to put it together yourself. And this is kind of a community of people who are doing that.
Yeah. And I remember the second one. So thanks, Dave, for saving me with jumping in there. But the second one was more around, Dave's two different steps there. And the second one was more around the accounting side. A lot of you have asked when Dave's going to come out with his next book. And really, that was a preface to his next book, which hasn't been titled quite yet, but will be coming out in late summer timeframe, depending upon how we work things out with the publishers there. So that's the latest that you can be looking for Dave's next book.
Great.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks.